Hello all, and welcome to week 2 of remote teaching. I hope you had a good weekend and were able to relax a little. Today we will be focusing on Wheelock Chapter 34, Deponent Verbs and the Ablative with Special Deponents. Let's begin. Let's start with defining what a deponent verb actually is. Deponent verbs are verbs that have passive endings but active meanings. The good news is that they conjugate just like regular verbs in the passive, so there are very few new forms to be learned, only the imperatives. The most important thing about deponents are remembering which verbs are deponent so you know to translate them in the active voice. This is why vocab is key, though I do have a handout from my high school Latin teacher that lists the most common deponent verbs that I will share with you if I can find it. There are a few exceptions to the rule of passive forms' active meanings, and those will also need to be carefully noted. Don't worry, I will highlight them as we go through the forms of a deponent verb. So first let's look at the principal parts of a deponent verb, and then go over some quick trends in conjugation before looking at the full conjugation of one deponent verb. Unlike regular verbs, deponent verbs only have 3 principal parts, the passive equivalents of the first 3 principal parts of regular verbs. That is the first person singular present indicative, the present infinitive, and the first person singular perfect indicative. There are 5 examples of these verbs on your screen now, one from each conjugation. Let's focus on hortor, hortare, hortatus, sum. As you can see, the first principal part is the first person singular present indicative, the second principal part is the present infinitive, and the third principal part is the first person singular perfect indicative, but all are passive in form. As I mentioned before, these verbs are conjugated according to the same rules as regular verbs in the passive. We will go through the full conjugation of hortor in a minute, but the conjugations of all 5 of the example verbs can be found in the appendix of your book, pages 504 to 6 in the 7th edition, and pages 455 to 57 in the PDF of the 6th edition. Before we move on to the conjugation of hortor, I want to note one important thing about the conjugation of deponent verbs in the imperfect subjunctive. As you'll recall, the imperfect subjunctive is normally formed by adding the personal endings to the present active infinitive. Deponent verbs, by definition, do not have active infinitive because all forms are passive. However, you do not just add the personal endings to the infinitive in its passive form for deponent verbs. Instead, you have to form what would be the present active infinitive and add personal endings to that. So for hortor, hortare, which is first conjugation, you create the present active infinitive hortare and add the endings to that. We will see a full conjugation of this shortly. We will start with the present in both the indicative and the subjunctive. In the indicative, the first person singular is hortor, the second person singular is hortaris, the third person singular is hortator, the first person plural is hortamor, the second person plural is hortamini, and the third person plural is hortantor, and it is translated as I urge, you urge, he, she, it urges, we urge, y'all urge, and they urge. Since hortor, hortare is a first conjugation verb, the present subjunctive is formed by replacing the theme vowel A with an E in the we beat a liar friar mnemonic. Following this system, the present subjunctive is hortare in the first person singular, hortaris in the second person singular, hortator in the third person singular, hortamor in the first person plural, hortamini in the second person plural, and hortentor in the third person plural. As you all recall, the subjunctive is usually translated differently depending on what type of clause it is in. But for now we will say that this is translated as I may urge, you may urge, he, she, it may urge, we may urge, y'all may urge, and they may urge, but yet again that may not show up. Now on to the imperfect in the indicative and subjunctive. Just like with regular verbs, the imperfect indicative is formed by adding the imperfect ending bar, baris, etc. to the stem of the verb. So for hortor, hortare, the imperfect indicative is as follows: hortabar in the first person singular, hortabaris in the second person singular, hortabator in the third person singular, hortabamor in the first person plural, hortabamini in the second person plural, and hortabantor in the third person plural. It would be translated as I was urging, you were urging, he, she, it was urging, we were urging, y'all were urging, and they were urging. As I mentioned 2 slides earlier, the imperfect subjunctive is normally formed by adding the personal endings to the present active infinitive. Deponent verbs by definition do not have an active infinitive because all the forms are passive. However, you do not just add the personal endings to the infinitive in its passive form. Instead, you have to form what would be the present active infinitive and add the personal endings to that. So for hortor hortare, which is first conjugation, you create the present active infinitive hortari and add the endings to that. Following this process, for hortor hortare, we get the first person singular hortarer, the second person singular hortareris, the third person singular hortaretor, the first person plural hortaremor, the second person plural hortaremini, and the third person plural hortarentor. The subjunctive is usually translated differently depending on what type of clause it is in, but for now we will say that this is translated as I might urge, you might urge, he, she, it might urge, we might urge, y'all might urge, and they might urge, but yet again that might may not appear. Since there is no future subjunctive, both the conjugations we will be looking at on this slide are indicative, the future indicative and the future perfect indicative. The future indicative is conjugated as follows: hortabor in the first person singular, hortaberis in the second person singular, hortabitor in the third person singular, hortabimor in the first person plural, hortabimini in the second person plural, and hortabuntor in the third person plural. Remember that the third AO, and fourth conjugations do not use the be endings for the future, but instead are, eris, ator, amor, amini, and entor. It would be translated as I will urge, you will urge, he, she, it will urge, we will urge, y'all will urge, and they will urge. The future perfect is formed just like with normal verbs, by combining the fourth principal part, agreeing in gender, case, and number, with the subject of the sentence, and the future indicative of sum esse. For hortor, this gives us hortatus a ero in the first person singular, hortatus a eris in the second person singular, hortatus a erit in the third person singular, hortati I a eramus in the first person plural, hortati I a eritis in the second person plural, and hortati I a erunt in the third person plural. It would be translated as I will have urged, you will have urged, he, she, it will have urged, we will have urged, and y'all will have urged, and they will have urged. Now on to the perfect and indicative in the subjunctive. As with regular verbs, these are formed like predicate nominatives with the perfect passive participle and the present indicative of sum in the perfect indicative, and the present subjunctive of sum in the perfect subjunctive. The indicative conjugates as follows: hortatus a sum in the first person singular, hortatus a s in the second person singular, hortatus a est in the third person singular, hortati I a sumus in the first person plural, hortati I a estis in the second person plural, and hortati I a sunt in the third person plural. It will be translated as I urged, you urged, he, she, it urged, we urged, y'all urged, and they urged. The subjunctive is similar, but with the present subjunctive of sum. Hortatus a sim in the first person singular, hortatus a sis in the second person singular, hortatus a sit in the third person singular, hortati I a simus in the first person plural, hortati I a sitis in the second person plural, hortati I a sint in the third person plural. Yet again, since the subjunctive is usually translated differently depending on what type of clause it is in, we will for now say that this is translated as I may have urged, you may have urged, he, she, it may have urged, we may have urged, y'all may have urged, and they may have urged, but that may not appear. Finally, the pluperfect indicative and subjunctive. The pluperfect indicative is the perfect passive participle with the imperfect of sum. Hortatus a eram in the first person singular, hortatus a eras in the second person singular, hortatus a erat in the third person singular, hortati I a eramus in the first person plural, hortati I a eratis in the second person plural, and hortati I a erant in the third person plural. It is translated as I had urged, you had urged, he, she, it had urged, we had urged, y'all had urged, and they had urged. The pluperfect subjunctive is similar, but with the imperfect subjunctive of sum. Hortatus essem in the first person singular, hortatus ess in the second person singular, hortatus esset in the third person singular, hortati essemus in the first person plural, hortati essetis in the second person plural, and hortati essent in the third person plural. Since the subjunctive is usually translated differently depending on what type of clause it is in, we will for now say that this is translated as I might have urged, you might have urged, he, she, it might have urged, we might have urged, y'all might have urged, and they might have urged, but yet again that might may not appear. The participles of deponent verbs present some interesting oddities. It does have the same four participles as regular verbs: present active, perfect passive, future active, and future passive or gerundive. Three of these present an exception to the rule that deponents are passive in form but active in meaning. The present and future active participles are active forms with active meanings, while the future passive / gerundive is a passive form with a passive meaning. Finally, translation-wise, the perfect passive participle is not translated as passive but active, so instead of having been verbed, it's just having verbed. The four participles of our sample verb hortor are hortans, urging, in the present active, hortatus having urged, in the perfect passive, hortaturus about to urge, in the future active, and hortandus about to be urged or must be urged, as the gerundive / future passive. Infinitives present even more oddities than the participles. As you'll recall, there are normally 5 infinitives: present active, present passive, perfect active, perfect passive, and future active. Deponents, since they are passive in form but active in meaning, should in theory only have present active and perfect active, but with passive forms. However, it also has a future active, which is a present form with active meaning. The three participles of hortor are as follows: hortari, to urge, in the present, hortatus esse, to have urged, in the perfect, and hortaturus esse, to be about to urge, in the future. Finally, the only new forms you actually have to learn in this chapter, the imperatives. The imperatives of deponent verbs would naturally have the forms of the present passive imperative. These do actually exist, but Wheelock has not given them before because they usually only appear with deponent verbs. The good news is that they are very easy to form, use, and recognize. The second person singular imperative looks just like what the present active infinitive would look like. So for hortor, that is hortare, urge. The second person plural looks exactly like the second person plural present indicative, hortamini, urge. There are some verbs that are what we like to call semi-deponent. These are verbs that are normal in the present system, but deponent in the perfect system, meaning that their perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect forms are passive in form, but active in meaning. You can see this in their principal parts. The verb audeo, audere, ausus sum is semi-deponent because it only has 3 principal parts, and the perfect is clearly passive, but active in translation. The same with gaudio, gaudere, gauisus sum. Deponent verbs, as passive in form but active in meaning, can take accusative direct objects, something that sets them apart from purely passive verbs. However, certain deponent verbs take the ablative as their object instead of the accusative. The only one that Wheelock uses is utor, which means to use, but others include fruor, fungor, potior, and wescor, which I have chosen to include in case they appear in sight readings in the future. An example of this in use can be seen in the sample sentence on your screen. Cicero Graecis literis utebator, which is translated as Cicero used to enjoy Greek literature. As you can see, the ablative Graecis literis is the object of utebator. Now practice parsing and identifying sentence. Cura pecuniam crescentem sequitur et dives male dormit. As always, let's start by finding the verbs. There are 2 in this sentence, sequitur and dormit. Since neither of these is subjunctive, and they are joined by the conjunction et, they are both main verbs. Let's start with everything before the et. The first main verb is sequitur, which is a third person singular present active indicative. The subject of this verb is the feminine nominative singular cura. The direct object of sequitur is the feminine accusative singular pecuniam, which is modified by the feminine accusative singular present active participle crescentem. After the conjunction et, the second main verb is dormant, which is a third-person singular present active indicative. The subject of this verb is masculine nominative singular substantive adjective dives. Since dormant is intransitive, which means it doesn't take a direct object, we have no accusatives. The final element of this sentence is the adverb male. If we put this all together, the sentence is translated as follows. Anxiety follows growing money, and the rich man sleeps badly. That's all for this chapter, folks. Be sure to get your forum sentence in by the end of the day Tuesday, your Chapter 34 worksheet to Blackboard or email by Friday, end of day, and to read Chapter 35 before watching the video that will be posted on Wednesday. If you have any questions, please email me. We can chat via email or set up a video session if you would prefer. Valete omnes.